Welcome to the Weekly Bark, where ordinary people are talking about extraordinary things. Sit back and enjoy the ride. The Weekly Bark.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Weekly Bark. My name is Jesse Moss. I'm the host, and today I have a special guest in the studio with me and a colleague. He's a friend of mine. His name's William Kamffer. William was born in South Africa, immigrated to the United States back in 1999 at the age of 15, moved to North Carolina. He attended Methodist University and earning a Bachelor of Arts degree in English Literature and History with a minor in creative writing. Moved to California in 2007 to attend grad school at Cal State Long Beach, and then earned a master's degree in English literature with a focus on medieval studies. He had some success in the early days of ebooks as a self-published author, held numerous jobs such as landscaper, custodial worker, bookseller, barista, private tutor, college lecturer, construction worker, and eventually teacher, right? He's been teaching for 11 years, 4 as a college lecturer and 7 as a high school teacher. His interests include philosophy, especially in regards to ethics, medieval literature, gardening, and cooking. Welcome to the show, William. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming. I appreciate you taking time out of your day. So you're kind of a jack of all trades, man.
I've been around.
Yeah. Have you ever heard that whole parable for the jack of all trades? So it's jack of all trades, master of none. Do you know how it ends?
No.
Thank God for TikTok. I just learned the rest of that story. So it goes like it's something like jack of all trades, master of none, but often better than a master of one.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah.
It's kind of so it takes a whole different twist when you put that whole end on it.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah. So how did you end up in all those different occupations?
Well, a lot of it has to do with early days after moving to the States. My family, were on a particular visa. Only my stepfather could work, and so coming out of high school, I had pretty much no options. It was really difficult to get into college, to pay for college. My parents didn't have a lot of money. So some of those early jobs were sort of odd jobs for people paying under the table, working for a friend who ran a landscaping company, another friend who had a janitorial company. I ended up working for 4 years as a janitor at a dialysis center through a contract, which was a bit of a nightmare, but it paid for much of my college at the time. And then, a lot of the rest of it was, working, coming out of my bachelor's degree, trying to find a job to start with, ending up at Barnes & Noble, working as a bookseller, going through the whole Starbucks route as well. And then, I landed my dream job working as a lecturer at Long Beach after finishing my master's. And that was kind of right at the time that the economic kind of crisis happened here around 2008, 2009.
Yeah.
And they started making budget cuts, and it wasn't too long before being the bottom of the pile meant that my classes were gone.
Sure.
So I ended up again with another friend who had a construction company taking me on for a while, which was quite possibly the worst year of my life for a bunch of reasons. But I mean, that was I've told my kids these days, my students, that I'll go work at McDonald's before I do construction again.
Really?
It was that bad.
What made it that bad?
It was soul destroying to me in the sense that, and I admire the people that I worked with, that they could go there, do that, and some of them really loved it. But it was so antithetical to what I liked and enjoyed, and what I saw, especially coming from having had my dream job teaching college, to doing this where nobody trusted me to do much of anything other than swing a sledgehammer to take down a wall.
Right.
So it was soul destroying. It was incredibly humbling, and it was absolutely just terrible for my mental health as well.
It's funny you bring that up because I just gotten hired in 2006 as a school teacher here in this district, and as that happened, we were going through cutbacks too, and they were doing teacher furloughs. And for whatever reason, like the list would come out, that seniority list, and you would just go, there would be a number, and they'd say, we're going up to whatever number. And I remember going, God, what's my number, right? And looking at that list. And luckily, for whatever reason, I always missed by 1 or 2. But I've known several of colleagues, people we've worked with, that they got furloughed a couple of times during those process, and then when the money came back, they got rehired later on. But it was, gosh, could you imagine? You obviously you went through it too, but that whole, I don't know what I'm doing. This is what I went to school for. In certain cases, people had student loans that were up the wazoo to go ahead and just get into this profession. And then every year it was at that time was like, man, am I going to have a job in 3 months and what to do?
And to make it even more exciting, I was brand new married, 6 months before. So, new bride, suddenly she has to support me when, the sort of the foundation just fell out from underneath my feet. So that was pretty rough, which is why, we say now that after what we went through in the first sort of 2 years of our marriage, we could probably handle anything at this stage.
Sure. I was reading a book last night by Napoleon Hill. Have you ever heard of him?
Yeah.
Anyway, one of his famous quotes is that in every adversity lies the seed of an equal or greater benefit. And it's not always apparent at the time, but I imagine that they, like you just said, that we've weathered that storm as a couple, so that's probably paid off for you guys in dividends, I'm sure, as life has moved forward.
I think so.
You're talking about soul crushing. When I was in college, I was in a band. I was going to go be a rock star, right? And so we had, in those days, we'd rent these 24-hour lockout studios, which would be a room about this size, which is like 8 by 8 or something like that. Yeah. And we'd throw up all our stuff, but we had to pay this monthly rent. And I think at the time it was like $300 a month. But we could go practice anytime we wanted. We could be as loud as we wanted. It was in an industrial complex. And I had worked a deal out with the guy, the owner, that I would be the janitor for this 24-hour lockout to waive my portion of the rent. So I think it was $100 or whatever. So I had to clean this place like once a week. So 4 times a month for my portion of the rent. You want to talk about the worst job ever? Go to where a bunch of musicians are hanging out and partying and clean that bathroom after a weekend of that. It was God, soul crushing was a light statement there.
Yeah.
Yeah. What other occupation, being that you've tried all those, what other occupation would you like to try if you're given an opportunity?
So I think I'd probably like to cook.
Yeah.
I enjoy cooking. My wife doesn't cook pretty much at all, and I do all of that, and it's not out of obligation. It's just I really enjoy it as one of my creative outlets, and I'm not sure I'd want to go work in a restaurant on a line or that kind of pressure, but to work as maybe sort of a private chef or one of these sort of catering chefs that comes in and does a party.
Yeah.
I could see kind of really enjoying putting together a big meal for an occasion like that and being able to wipe my hands and walk away at the end of the night,
Yeah, it'd be fun. I actually, have you heard about John Bon Jovi's Soul Kitchen?
No.
So John Bon Jovi put together this. It's for basically for where homeless people can come get a free meal. Anybody can come get a free meal, and other people can just go and buy a meal. And so it's a little restaurant that him and his wife and I guess his kids will go and volunteer at too to actually cook the meals. But it's just a way of feeding the hungry in his community. And I thought that'd be fun to volunteer in a place like that to do something. Yeah, maybe that'd be a place where it wouldn't be the pressure of being in a high end restaurant, but yet you could put do something in the community as well.
Yeah, really feel like you're helping people.
Yeah. So when I gave you that list of questions that you wanted to talk about, you put this one on there. Yeah, I laughed when I saw it. What would you do if you got $10 million tomorrow?
So I put this one on here as a little bit of an evangelism sort of thing, right? So one of my perhaps pet projects or so is evangelizing for effective altruism. Mm-hmm. So this is the sort of the concept of looking for causes that you can donate to, whether it's money or time, that whatever you give goes a long way. It goes, because a lot of these organizations might be run pretty badly. The money's not spent well. So you're looking for places where you can spend that money effectively. In the first world, we live such rich lives, most of us, without even realizing it, even if we're relatively poor in the U.S., we're within the top 4% or so of the global population in terms of income.
Wow, yeah.
And so looking for those opportunities, of course, you're looking at Africa, one of your top spots. People don't really think about, how many lives you can save by just donating $50 a month for malaria nets, So to answer that question about 10 million, I really have nothing myself that I want. I mean, I paid off student loans, all that sort of good stuff. And I think my first thing I would do is I'd pay down a retirement for my parents, who pretty much gave up everything to move my family, from South Africa across the pond. And after that, the rest of it goes to, charities. I have a few that I push for in Africa. There's a couple animal rights charities as well here in the States that I'm big on. A lot of my students always ask, hey, are you vegan? And I say, I have the soul of a vegan, but unfortunately, my body tends to give out after a year every time I switch. But I try my best on that. But
are you vegetarian then?
Again, as much as I can. It's more an issue of it's kind of a catch-22 in terms of if I don't eat meat, then I have to take a lot of supplements.
Gotcha.
And my concern about supplements comes down to artificial nature of a lot of that. I know there are a few these days that are coming out more available that are all natural and all that. So perhaps I'll go down that road again in a year or two.
Sure.
But I'd say at this stage probably pescatarian is the best way to describe me. Sort of maybe 3 days a week I'll have some fish to kind of keep that up. But so I try to push for a lot of support for animal programs here in the States, and as I say, a lot of charities in Africa.
Diet's become this weird. So I've been watching a lot of different people and talking about being vegan or vegetarian and dealing with that, and have heard wonderful stories where people have gone a certain direction and were able to fix a plethora of ills that were going on in their bodies. And but none of them seem to agree exactly on the method. And it almost seems to me that diet becomes such a personal sort of experiment, because everybody's going to be a little different. For instance, I know people who are vegan and they thrive and they love it. My sister for a while was vegetarian, and she didn't do so hot that way because she just supplemented all the junk food in the world, right?
Right. Well, this is the problem.
Exactly. And so, but it becomes such a profoundly personal thing. But almost we become evangelical, sometimes where if I'm on paleo and everybody should do paleo. Well, maybe not,
Yeah. Well, there's the old joke about vegans, which is, how do you know if someone's vegan? They're going to tell you, right?
Right. There you go. Oh man, I wanted to talk. You brought up earlier, and I know it wasn't in our talking points. And if you don't want to talk about it, we don't have to. But tell me a little bit on your family uprooting and moving across the globe, essentially changing hemispheres and all that. That had to be a tough decision.
Yes, of course, apartheid ended in the early 90s in South Africa, and it sort of threw the country into a bit of turmoil, especially amongst the white population. They really didn't know what South Africa was going to be in 10 years' time. When Zimbabwe, country just to the north, had formerly Rhodesia, when the British pulled out of there, the country very quickly became kind of overrun with civil war and infighting, and they ended up with Robert Mugabe as president, and so a lot of white South Africans were really concerned that South Africa might end up in the same sort of pot. And my parents were kind of looking at it from the perspective of, where can my sisters, and I have two younger sisters, where can we make a life that for the next 50 years we can live in security, right? And at the time, my parents were looking kind of all over the place. I say my parents, it's my stepfather and mother. My dad still lives in South Africa, and despite my pleas to get out, this is home. He's not going to leave. So my stepfather, my mom were looking. One of the considerations was New Zealand. We have quite a bit of family there. But at the end of the day, one of the big influences was the fact that the church that my family was involved in at the time in South Africa was a sort of a missionary hub for a number of American missionaries who would come into Southern Africa, and then they'd sort of be spread out from there. And for some odd reason, the vast majority of the missionaries that cycled through were from North Carolina. And so sort of a lot of our contacts were to there, and that's sort of planted the seed to go to the south. Well, I mean, from there it was a case of just exploring the options, and it was probably in one sense a smart move, simply because had that not happened, my sisters and I would probably have left the country anyway. You know, South Africa has experienced over the last 20, 25 years a bit of a white flight of the young generation, the sort of the millennials, going outside the country looking for education opportunities that are just not really there in the country itself. And it's not only, you know, sort of the white population. I mean, the best and brightest of the native population are going out to, you know, America, to the UK, Australia as well, as they're being recruited.
Interesting. I think it's easy in America for us to be sort of to live our life with kind of blinders on and think the whole world is kind of like us, and not realize some of that stuff that's going on there. I remember living in Europe at the time. And I was there in the early 90s, and we saw a lot of people, not just from South Africa. I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on across the Middle East at the time, and other African nations. You had I think you had the civil war in Sudan that had started. So there was a lot of refugees kind of fleeing into anywhere they could get away to. I'd met an interesting guy in Germany one time, and he was a Palestinian, but he was Christian, and so they fled because they felt like the same kind of similar situation. The father got the kids out to Europe because they kind of caught between two worlds. You had the Islamic Palestinians, and then you had the people in Israel. And it was like they didn't fit into either one of those groups.
Right.
And so it was like, we got to go somewhere where we could kind of, you know, at least just live peaceably. And so, interesting. So a literature major, that's my alley. That's my thing. What books have changed your life?
So I've had a bit of a complicated relationship with books. Surprisingly, I was not very interested in English in school, in high school. It was more the influence, I think, of an English teacher, 11th grade. That was the year that I did British Lit, and we read Beowulf for the first time that year. I read Beowulf for the first time that year. And it was a story that immediately kind of woke in me memories of stuff that I was used to really interested in when I was a kid. You know, when I was young, I'm talking like 5 to 10 years old, I was really interested in stories of King Arthur, really interested in medievalism. I used to go to the local public library and take out encyclopedias and look up, you know, historic characters from the Middle Ages and just read about them, not understanding half of what, you know, was there. So Beowulf kind of brought that back a little bit, but I didn't really feel like that changed my life quite so much as the next book, big book that I read, which was more in response to actually watching a movie. And that was the Lord of the Rings, the first film, Fellowship of the Ring. And I knew nothing about the book, never read fantasy in my life. And a high school friend of mine says, "Come on, you got to come see this film." And he dragged me to a dollar theater at the end of January. So, you know, this movie's been out for a month, you know.
Right.
I hadn't even heard of it. And I walked in skeptical, and I walked out with my mind blown. And by the end of February, so a month later, I'd read, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and The Silmarillion. And by the end of March, I'd read pretty much everything else that I could get out of the local Barnes and Noble. And basically, I don't think it's too far of a stretch to say that if I hadn't read Lord of the Rings at the time, we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation.
Gotcha.
I would not be an English teacher. My life path was to become an accountant. Okay. That's what I desperately wanted to do with my life, which tells you an awful lot about me as a teenager. But yeah, so Lord of the Rings completely transformed me. I started writing stories myself. I started reading. It's like, who is this kid? My family had no idea who I was overnight.
Right. That's great. Do you find that you have enough time to read as much as you like to nowadays? Or do you find, because I know as me as a teacher, and one of the reasons why I started this podcast is it's easy to get caught up in just doing the grind of work and not using those creative outlets. And so before I tried to start a writer's group where we kind of would get together once a week and share what we were writing, and that fell apart pretty quick because everybody got really busy. And I've tried to do book clubs, and so I've always been looking for these creative outlets to try to do that and goals. But one of the things I don't do enough of, and so I've really made that like a 2022 goal for myself, is I'm going to read daily something, and I don't care what it is. And but I want to read daily for myself, and then find and write more. So I started the blog and the podcast, which kind of go hand in hand. How about you? Do you find that you get a chance to read and write as much as you like to anymore?
Yeah, well, I'd say yes and no. I definitely read quite a bit. I read at least 2 books a month. So I don't know if that's a lot for an English teacher. I've heard from some of our colleagues here on campus that that sounds like that's quite a lot. But I also know for myself, given my time mismanagement when I'm at home, that I'm probably capable of 4 or 5 books a month if I did so. I definitely don't write as much as I used to. I've really struggled with that off and on. But reading, you mentioned this year you could sort of had a bit of a plan to read more. My goal this year was I really wanted to sort of mix up both fiction and nonfiction. So I've got a goal of 1 nonfiction book a month, something challenging, something to learn from. So, I've been reading some history and philosophy so far this year, and then working on a novel at a time. And so, and I'm also trying to kind of step outside of my comfort zone when it comes to novels. So I've been picking up some literary fiction, which is not something I normally read for fun, but
it's funny you mentioned that. I'm reading Crime and Punishment right now in conjunction with the Napoleon Hill book I was telling you about. So because I've had a love-hate relationship with the Russians, man. I love Tolstoy's short stories, but I can never get through a novel.
Yeah.
And I've tried to get through Crime and Punishment in the past a couple of times, and I'd get like a chapter in and I'd be done. And so right now I'm on a good path, man. I'm 7 chapters in. It's almost done with part 1 here. So hopefully I can make it this time. But
I'm with you on the Russians, the short stories, but never been able to. And to be frank, I've never had much of a desire to pick up one of those doorstops, So,
right.
As you mentioned up top, my interest in speciality is much more in medieval literature, So I'll sit and struggle through, Chaucer in Middle English any day of the week, but
right.
I won't touch a Russian novel.
Right. Well, have you ever finished a doorstop novel? Have you ever done one cover to cover?
Of the Russians?
No, of anybody.
Would you say Lord of the Rings?
I guess, but I almost consider them like a standalone, like you could do one at a time.
I suppose that's true. Let's see.
So like Les Miserables, I finished that one. I did that one, and I'm really glad I forced myself through that, but that was hard. And I think the first one and I don't even know if I'd call it a doorstop, but it's a fairly big book. But it was going right back into your King Arthur thing. Was I think her name's Marion Zimmer Bradley, and she did The Mists of Avalon. Yes. Yeah. So I forced so I did that when I was in the Army, and I got stationed in Somalia. And so that was the first doorstop book I'd ever went through. But I had all the time in the world. We had nothing to do when we weren't working, right?
Yeah.
And so it was easy to get through that book. But I'm so glad I did, because those doorstop books, if you have the discipline to get through them, they can be really rich and really rewarding, but it's really tough. So and then after I got through Les Miserables, that was pretty much it. And then I thought about doing War and Peace. I'm like, nah, not happening.
Yeah. I'd probably say the longest that I've put myself through are a couple of Dickens novels. And it's just not my thing.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, life's too short. I'd rather read a book that I'm being pulled along by, even if I'm, struggling a little bit with it. As again, I read in Middle English as opposed to a modernization, and I'll read that for pleasure. But even Dickens,
Yeah.
No,
No.
not going to do it.
Yeah, and I like Dickens. For me, yeah, you're right. I'm not going to go do Great Expectations or Bleak. God, I'll never do Bleak House, right? It's just not happening. But I do A Christmas Carol every year.
Sure.
Like, I love that one, and sometimes I'll do The Cricket on the Hearth. But A Christmas Carol to me, and I'll quote that throughout the year. Mankind is my business. The common welfare is my business. Like there's like these little quotable parts that I just love out of that with Dickens. We were talking a while back, and I want to revisit this. We were talking about genius, and we were talking about the whole idea. And you said something I had never really thought about it before, but we were kind of talking about how Shakespeare wasn't really all that creative in terms of coming up with plots, but really creative in like the human psychology and character development and conflict. And pretty much ripped off every plot he ever wrote, right? I mean, he either got it from Holingham's Chronicles or these folklores and like Tristan and Isolde and whatever. Right. But then you mentioned something about genius and how that flipped with the Romantics. Can you go and can we revisit that again?
Yeah. So the modern English word genius comes from a Roman term, genius or genii, which is originally in the Latin, it referred to a sort of personal attendant spirit. Not that dissimilar from what the Greeks had, this concept of the daemon, or even in sort of Judeo-Christian thought of the sort of the guardian angel, right? So it's this idea of the spirit who looks over you, who works through you, who connects you to the gods and to nature and all this sort of thing, right? So the Romans would speak about somebody having a particularly strong genius. And so this was the idea that a powerful person, someone, let's say Julius Caesar, right? He would have a powerful genius of war, for example, right? And so this would be a spirit that worked through him in the world to accomplish great things. Whereas the ordinary folk, their genius was sort of minor, right? And what this did for the mindset was it gave the sense in which the accomplishments of men, I would assume women as well, but certainly of men as recorded and the things that they wrote was attributable to the genius moving through the person, right? Now, by about the 400s AD, so period of St. Augustine, kind of the last ages or the last years of the Roman Empire, there's evidence that that in Latin the word had kind of come to have two meanings. So it was still that original sense of the spirit working through you, but it was also a stand-in for the person themselves, right? So a genius was both the spirit working through and the person who had the strong genius, right? And so that kind of dual meaning persisted throughout the Middle Ages. And what's kind of interesting in the Middle Ages is that a huge number, I hesitate to say the majority, but I probably am not wrong if I say the majority of work that survives from the Middle Ages is anonymous. And a huge part of the reason for that is the mindset of the person is that this isn't mine. It's given from God. It's inspired by, right? And that word inspired, of course, means breathed into, right? So you're being breathed into by the genius, being breathed into by God. And of course, as you know, the opening of the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid, just the invocation to the Muses, who are sort of almost like super geniuses, right? Or
Right.
So that speak to you at special moments to inspire the greatest of all works. And so this dual meaning, as this word got adopted into English, after our conversation, went back and had a little look to just kind of clarify exactly when that shift happened. It seems like it was sometime in the late 17th century, early 18th century, that the meaning of genius as being sort of spirit dropped away. And all we were left with in English was the meaning in the terms of how we use it now, a person who is a genius. But what's interesting is again, the mindset that comes with that is that it's this work is not necessarily my own, right? It's breathed into me, it's breathed through me by some sort of celestial being, right? And even Milton, in the conventions of epic poetry, he opens Paradise Lost with a calling out to the Holy Spirit. But obviously, as a Christian, very devout, it's more than that for him as well. I mean, he is asking God to speak through him, the Spirit of God and it's very much harkening back to that idea that this poem is not mine if it works. It's the work of God through me.
And it's been a minute since I've read Milton, but didn't he kind of start with the Muses and switch to the Holy Spirit?
Yeah,
kind of to stay good with his, like he tried to do it in the classical sense of I'm going to invoke the Muse here, but then to line up with his theology, he kind of shifts into now it's the Holy Spirit becomes the Muse. Am I off on that?
Off the top of my head, I'm trying to think if that's accurate. Without having the text in front of me, I can't say. So I'm not going to.
I have to look that up. Yeah, but I think there was a thing about that where he was dabbling in both of those worlds and really trying to Christianize a classical Greek idea.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's no doubt that Milton is playing with classical conventions, and I mean, as you see from anyone, I mean, even again in the very Christian Middle Ages, the very Christian Reformation and Renaissance periods. A lot of the literature and a lot of the art is still very pagan in terms of its iconography and its language and stuff, but it's sanitized,
right?
So I think very much what you're saying there, So I mean, you get Milton and these guys playing with that kind of languge, and
what happened with the Romantics, though?
Well, so I think it's unironic what's happening there with Milton, and in the sense it's still it's not from me. But what we have with the Romantics, right? So Milton is sort of at the beginning period of a movement in literature that's sort of the classical period, right? So it's very much harkening back to ancient Rome, ancient Greece, and sort of very overtly playing with those themes and tropes. And the Romantics, of course, is a movement directly in opposition to classicism, right? So for them, sort of the cardinal sin was to be derivative, right? And so you really have this switch in mindset, because if you have your genius that's speaking to you, right, that's not you,
right?
That's coming from outside. And of course, if you look at any of the greatest works of literature, shall we say the classical canon, right? The vast majority of that is, like Shakespeare, plots taken from somebody before, built upon. I mean, Milton, we just mentioned a moment ago. I mean, he's just taken Genesis 1-3,
right, and
just spun it into 300 pages. So the Romantics kind of looked at that, askance, and they're like, no, this is not what art is, because all you're doing is you're copying somebody, right? And so for them, that sort of being derivative was the cardinal sin. It all had to come from within, and suddenly the impetus is all on the individual to be the font of creativity, right? And we mentioned before when you and I were speaking about this that the image of the starved, tormented, suicidal even artist. It's not really something that you see prior to the Romantics. I mean, it's almost birthed with the Romantic period, with some of the larger-than-life figures, of literature, of art, of music, and so on. And I think it's a really transformative moment in how we, especially in the West, view creativity, because I think even though most artists today of various forms would not consider themselves romantics, they're still influenced by that sense in which my work needs to be original in some way, and it's like this incredible pressure that we put on ourselves to be original.
Sure, Well, it's as a musician, it's like really something I've wrestled with a lot. Is like I used to get really offended because people would go, "Oh man," because I played music I wrote, particularly for my daughter who's 23 now, and she would be like, "Oh, Dad, it sounds so 1980s," and I'm like, What? That's how, it's like, how do you get 80s out of that other than the fact that, I came from the 80s, right? But then The Weeknd came out, and then I'm like, he sounds like he's from the 1980s, so maybe it's not a bad thing, and all that. But it's this constant, this desire to constantly have to come up with something new makes it almost impossible, and I think it can force you to not ever create art if you're not careful.
Yeah. Well, I think it's an interesting problem and kind of a modern concern. I'm curious, if we could travel back in time and we we walk into the Globe after a play, right? And you say, hey, Shakespeare, that echoes Chaucer to me, I wonder if he'd feel like, no, that's so 200 years ago, or if he'd actually take that as a compliment, I
think you take it as a compliment.
Right.
Well, I see where Shakespeare even had a sense of humor with himself. So if we take it like Romeo and Juliet, right? And you go, okay, well, that's kind of a ripoff of Tristan and Isolde, maybe, or whatever, because I guess there's several other stories that would
Italian
fit.
stories and such, yeah.
Yeah. And so, but even Shakespeare, I don't think took that play too seriously, because that's the play within the play of, is it Midsummer Night's Dream, where they're looking through the hole in the fence and I die, and he does the grandiose, comedy of the suicides at the end, right? So even Shakespeare would give, and that's one of the beauties I love about reading Shakespeare, is he would have a commercial for his own plays within his plays, but he didn't take himself too seriously because he'd make them super absurd. Yeah. So I often wondered, was Romeo and Juliet playing on the other nights of the week when Midsummer Night's Dream came out, and this was just his way of pitching, quickly, hey, there's this play going on there.
Yeah. Well, it's a sort of self-reflection, right? But yeah, no, I mean, Shakespeare's an interesting one. I mean, coming back to him in the sense of, as you said at the top, sort of his use of language, his psychology. It's not the plot lines, that makes him special, right? And it's the tortured human psychology, or the clever insights. It's the wordplay, and I think that's. I mean, there's a whole slew of literature coming out today that is taking plot lines straight out of classical literature, right? Retellings of the Iliad, right, or of the Odyssey and so on, right? You can get away with that, right? Because Homer's not here to claim copyright law, right?
Yeah.
You turn around and you do that for, there was a fairly famous case a couple of years ago where I think it was a Swedish guy wrote a sequel, attempted to publish a sequel for Catcher in the Rye. And he was shut down with a lawsuit because the character of Holden Caulfield is not his own, right? But, who owns a character? Right, it's only because we have copyright law that somebody's decided that since 1929, or whenever it is exactly in the 20s, right?
Yeah.
Suddenly, from that date onwards, you cannot copy a certain amount before it becomes outright theft. Before that, it's fair game, right? I mean, I could sit down and write a Sherlock Holmes novel right now and publish it, make a bunch of money, right? But how's that any different? So. I guess that's, it gets into that question of where's the line between, borrowing and plagiarism. And, there's obviously been a number of high-profile cases when it comes to music as well.
It's a weird world we live in, because everything's sort of becoming copyright. I mean, if I put a YouTube video on and I have music playing in another room, even though I'm not even realistically trying to use, I can have a video, shut down, or I can have it demonetized, just because that stuff trickles through. And going back to I think with characters though, with we grow a love affair with them, right? Like we get really close to certain characters, and you brought Sherlock Holmes up. Man, I wish somebody would write some more Sherlock Holmes, because I love that character. I love the whole premise of that story. And the same thing with the Hercule Poirot from Agatha Christie. And I love the fact that these are being reimagined into movies by Kenneth Branagh now. It's like that's I think that keeps that stuff alive, and it would be fun to see those. Well, that's going back to Shakespeare. One of the cool things about that is you had Baz Luhrmann, and he did this really over-the-top form of Romeo and Juliet. And the BBC's been pumping out these really kind of modern interpretations of these old plays to get this younger generation in it. And we were just watching Hamlet the other day, and it has closed-circuit TV to get the spying on there. And the kids were like, but wait a minute, there's sword fighting in one scene, and there's closed-circuit TV. How does this all work, right? These anachronisms are bothering us. But I think that's the beauty of trying to keep some of these stories alive. Well, hey, I kept you twice as long as I said I would. That went pretty quick, did it?
Yeah, it did.
I'd love to talk to you again. Maybe we could put that together and do this again at another time. But thank you for coming down. I appreciate you.
The Weekly Bark.